Hey everyone, I'm Penny. I'm a product manager on the Chrome Web Platform team. I'm going to be talking about installing any site as an app. One moment, and I'll get the presentation up here for you. So to begin with, just to get everyone on the same page, let's cover what installing is and why it's useful. Install is largely about integrating web apps into operating system capabilities, things like launching surfaces, share targets, badging, the ability to run on OS login, file system access, protocol handlers. However, by default, in Chromium installed apps are basically just tabs. Like they don't get a lot of extra powers. There are a few little things here and there, like for example, badging APIs don't really make much sense outside of the installed context. And installed apps also get flagged as important sites, which can be important for things like media autoplay and sort of side features. But right now, we don't gate very much on install. They're mostly just tabs. So there are some restrictions around what apps are installable and as well. Which apps are going to be promoted, at least in the Chrome UI. And these are the criteria. So these pages must be HTTPS, needs to have a manifest with some fields, service worker with a fetch handler, and it needs to meet an engagement heuristic. These install restrictions were put in place for a few reasons, but one of those was to help incentivize developers to make more quality app-like experiences. So in response to a fear that we would see perhaps proliferation of installable web apps of very low quality, leading users to the conclusion that web apps aren't good and they shouldn't use them. So it was intended to encourage implementation of offline modes with Service Worker, to consider what page layouts would look like when in display standalone, to encourage developers to instrument for analytics what display mode users are using, as well as a trigger for the before install prompt event that could be used by developers to promote the installation of their app. So why should we change this? Well, first, I would say philosophically, where possible, I think that capability should be under user control. So if users want to install a site or page, we should probably let them. Why not let users install their favorite Wordle app, even if the developer hasn't done everything that we say that they should do to make it a great app? That doesn't mean that the user can't have a great experience and doesn't want a launch screen icon for this app. In practice, we do see developers doing things that are anti-patterns, like shipping empty fetch handlers instead of operating a real offline mode, just so that they can enable this capability. So unfortunately, we do see behavior that we don't want to encourage. And then we've got this feedback loop. Most users are never learning about installs of capability because not enough sites implement it. Not many developers get excited about it because not many users know that it exists. So we want to break this feedback loop. And finally, we are hoping to ship a default offline mode. So most web apps will have the same basic offline functionality as many apps in an app store. And it can be done just with the contents of the manifest field. So there's less need for the full service worker offline support in the case of the vast majority of the apps these days, and many users are now familiar with apps that are basically cloud-based and don't work when offline. Obviously, there are exceptions to this rule, and we hope that those apps will continue to use Service Worker with a fetch handler to support full offline modes. So some may be wondering if we can't already do this with standalone shortcuts and add to home screen. And that's a good observation. Standalone shortcuts in Chrome on desktop and add to home screen on mobile already respect many manifest fields. So they're kind of already it's already a way for users to install. It's just not called install, but it does things that the user might not expect. For example, on desktop, if you create a shortcut, there's a checkbox that says open as window. If you check that checkbox, if that site has a manifest that is registering file or protocol handlers, those handlers are going to get registered. And that might not be something that a user is expecting from a shortcut. That's something more that a user is going to expect from an app. So we have this of user expectations around what install means and then what actually happens. Finally, it's also a bit complicated. We've got bookmarks, we've got shortcuts, we've got install. Perhaps there's ways we can simplify this to something that's just a bookmark that behaves like something that you would expect in a browser tab, and an installed app. And we more or less cut the sort of like add to home screen out of the slash shortcut out of the equation entirely. So how can we do this if we want to do this for all pages, even pages that don't even have a manifest? Well, I think one constraint here is we probably want to restrict this functionality to the root of an origin. So this will help us with, I think, with scoping problems where we have to assume a scope for the app. If we allow install on any subpath on an origin, and we restrict the scope of the app to that subpath, the chance of the user going to end up with a not very usable PWA is very high. So a counterexample would be like, for example, installing a subreddit, like our startled cats would actually maybe work quite well if all you wanted to do was view startled cats. But then if you pop up a level, you navigate somewhere else, you're going to get like a CCT-like view that's in the app shell, which is probably not desirable. I've been going with the phrase calling these ad hoc applications. They're basically, apps that the browser generates for the user based on the best information that it has available. I would like to differentiate installability from promotability. So just because, every site is installable doesn't necessarily mean that the browser should promote it. Something that I'm thinking a lot about is, how do we do this promotion more selectively? I hear user stories on both sides of the spectrum with how things are right now. I hear some users say when they visit an installable site, I didn't notice it. I didn't see the little install icon in the top right corner of the Omnibox, or I don't know how to go to the overflow menu and install. I also hear exactly the opposite, which is people visiting sites. Google Maps comes up a lot because it's a frequently used site, where they see that install icon and it's got a little bit of animation and it's actually a bit distracting and annoying. And they're saying, I want to use Google Maps in tab. I'm always going to want to use Google Maps in tab. So I think there's opportunity here for browsers to improve promotion based on utility to the user rather than just showing that promotion based on specific developer criteria being. There is this open question around how to upgrade to an installed application if we see a manifest later. So let's say the users installed the site didn't have a manifest, then the site adds a manifest. We are working on a proposal to around app identity updating to include like an update token and some protections around certain identity related fields in the manifest. Perhaps we could reuse the same mechanism and effectively present an upgrade UI to the user with the new icon, the new name that's now specified in the manifest, and offer to have the user install the update or ignore or delete the existing ad hoc application. There isn't, I think, a lot of additional abuse potential here because we're not going to fire the before install prompt any more often than we would before. Before install prompt will still be restricted to install criteria, the pre-existing install criteria, and we're not adding any API surface to developers. So this is still requiring user intervention through the browser. We just hope that because there's more consistent availability of the capability, that more users will learn about its existence because it will be persistently in the menu in the same place, and the user will hopefully learn that they can use it on any site, and then we'll think about whether or not there's more either heuristic or ML-based client data that might help us suggest to a user that they install or a site that seems to be particularly useful to them. If we have extra time today, we can have a discussion around perhaps a more imperative API like navigator.install. There is certainly abuse potential around something like this, but perhaps this could be something that's available to any site with the correct set of restrictions, user gesture, engagement, perhaps other controls to ensure that whenever you visit a spam site, it's not, in addition to notifications, enrollment, it's not also asking you to install. Okay, that's everything that I have. Let's open for the questions.
All right, we have one in the room.
So as part of this make any site more installable, is there some effort to maybe address some of the pain points around user-generated shortcuts? Like when I get a new Android device, I lose all the shortcuts I made on my old device and have to make them again from scratch, and just the different home screen management features you get for shortcuts versus installed apps.
So that I'd see that as adjacent work. We are very interested in being able to at least restore installed applications that are web APKs on Android. I'll maybe ask Glenn to chime in here, but I don't think that we can do anything about shortcuts because I don't think that we're able to know the state of shortcuts after they get created. I think they're basically fire and forget. And once the shortcut's dropped, we don't know whether it exists or not. So we couldn't safely restore it because we wouldn't know whether the user has deleted it. Glenn, anything you want to add there?
No, I think you covered everything. I believe that's right, that we can't really do a whole lot about shortcuts, especially since shortcuts, after they're created, are just sort of managed by the launcher app. And so depending on which launcher you run on Android, that could make things unreliable. But yes, we are starting to look into making sure that web APKs can be restored on new devices.
Okay. I guess what I was leading to is, should we deprecate shortcuts and make everything a web APK so that we get better functionality across the board, or kind of what's the idea?
Yeah, I see things basically forking in two ways. So yes, more things should be installed apps. And so like we should have this install option whenever the user's at the root of a site. I believe, and I'm still doing some UXR to confirm that this is the case, but I believe that the way the users are using home screen shortcuts right now is more aligned to how they use bookmarks. It's like a super bookmark or a bookmark plus. And this is something that they want to open the browser. They want to open to a browser tab, but they want to do they use it with such frequency that it's useful for them to have a home screen shortcut. And so I would see that as being, perhaps we add a button to the shortcut create journey that is to the bookmark create journey to drop a shortcut on a home screen. And then, or in the manage bookmarks page, the ability to just like tap a button and drop a new shortcut. Again, like we have this restriction of we don't know, we have no way of knowing what happens to the shortcut after it gets created. So unfortunately, we can't really like offer shortcut management through the bookmarks tool, but we could certainly make it easier for users to create them. And engagement data does suggest that users use these a lot more frequently than they use mobile bookmarks in particular, where they're just a little bit hard to get to, and they're kind of wish listy from the way that users behave with them. They're things that the user might hope they're going to get back to, but then probably never does.
All right, we're not seeing anything else. Penny, did you have some overtime things to talk about?
I'm very interested in thoughts on a general navigator.install API. Like what are reactions, fears?
Got one.
Perhaps not very related to a navigator.install, but earlier in BlinkOn, there was a discussion on isolated web apps. And while it's very clear the capabilities for install web apps and isolated web apps will be very different, do you envision a future where they are sort of the same thing, where I install the web app and it turns into an isolated web app and so on?
So one of the challenges there is the packaging and the integrity that's provided by the packaging is an essential component of the isolated web app. And we wouldn't be able to have that kind of integrity assertion made without the packaging step. So it would certainly be good if the journey was elegant from one to the next. So like if the user's got is either using a site in a tab, or they've got that tab installed as kind of a standard installed web app, if it's relatively straightforward for them to migrate into the isolated web app. But we also wouldn't want to share application state between the two. So something else that we're thinking about is something like a one-time state import possible. It's not in MVP, but perhaps that's something that we could look at later on, which would be like at install time, could we pull in application state from the tab into something like an isolated web app, or any kind of environment where the storage is not shared with the tab.
All right. Well, thank you, Penny.
Thank you, everyone.